Hi, my name is Omotayo Banjo. I am a professor in the School of Communication, Film and Media Studies at the University of Cincinnati. I also serve as Associate Dean of Research, Innovation, and Student Success in the Graduate College at the University of Cincinnati. In terms of the experience that led to my research question, I think it had a lot to do with my positionality as a second-generation American and my questions of identity. I also already had a propensity towards social justice issues anyway, and so that coupled with my questions about identity led me to study how I think media play a role in how we understand one another, and eventually it evolved into me wanting to look at how we portray ourselves, the stories we tell about ourselves, and how Black audiences experience Black entertainment. So that's how my interests have evolved over time.
Hi, my name is Wunpini Fatimata Mohammed. I am an assistant professor of communication at Cornell University. I am from Tamale, Ghana. I came to research. It was a long, winding journey. So growing up in Tamale, Ghana, I didn't see people like me on television. And when I say that, I mean that within the nation state, there are various identities that we often don't account for. So I was Muslim in a Christian dominant country. I was from a marginalized ethnic group and so many others. So when I watched TV, I didn't see myself on television. So I became interested in media and how it could be used to tell stories of disenfranchised communities. And so skipping up to my time here in the US in grad school, one of the driving questions for my research was basically interrogating power in all its forms. So if you look at a lot of the scholarship I've done, I've basically tried to interrogate how power sort of reinforces marginality from various perspectives. And so my research definitely reflects my identity, and it also reflects my experiences not just in Ghana but also here in the US, and how power dynamics often shape communities that are marginalized and their experiences within the nation. Navigating that. So for me, so I'm just going to say a little bit about the work that I do. So I do African media studies scholarship focusing specifically on Ghana. And the kind of scholarship that I do sort of disrupts the status quo in the sense that a lot of African media scholars focus on English language media or French language media or sometimes occasionally Portuguese language media, but I'm interested in indigenous language media within the context of Africa and how that connects to global indigeneity. So a lot of my scholarship where I look at indigenous language media connects to indigenous communities in North America and in Latin America and other parts of the world. And so how I navigate doing this kind of work is trying to situate my research within, for example, the context of Ghana and how that relates to the experiences of marginalized communities. So, for example, I'm looking at how media can be used as a tool for social change. And so if, let's say, I'm trying to talk about feminisms, I do it from a perspective that could be relatable to the masses. And another way that I navigate this is to bring legitimacy to the work that I do in the eyes of the communities that I work with, not academia. I don't care much about legitimacy within the academic space. I care more about the legitimacy of my work within these communities. And so I do this by, for example, in my methodologies, adapting my methodologies to suit the sociocultural context within which I work. So for example, I do a lot of research in rural communities, doing interviews and focus groups in my indigenous language, Dagbani. And so that means that when I was trained in the US to conduct focus groups in a particular way, when I went back home to northern Ghana to do this kind of work, I had to adapt it to suit the sociocultural context there. So that meant adapting focus groups into what I called communal conversation circles, which means that I adapted it to suit what interpersonal interactions within these communities look like, community interactions look like within these communities. And another way that I sort of navigate this is to basically try to bring these topics to the communities in ways that are relatable. So I do a lot of public scholarship. So when I'm in Ghana, I go on television and radio to talk about, you know, my research in the language of the people, literally in my first language, so that it reaches a wide variety of people. So one of the biggest struggles that we have as African scholars when we do politically charged research is to, again, the legitimacy, right? So a lot of the times we are accused of bringing in Western ideas into African communities and imposing Western cultural imperialism. Basically, that's what we get, especially with research around LGBTQI plus communities, research around feminisms. And so in the work that I do, for example, when I talk about LGBTQI plus communities, I go beyond saying, oh, it's African to be queer, and more toward looking at what human rights look like within the context of Africa. What do human rights look like within the context of my community? What do they look like within the context of Ghana, beyond what the UN defines human rights to be? What does feminism look like in indigenous communities? So these are some of the examples I pull to legitimize my work in the eyes of the people. And sometimes it means you may not necessarily use the word feminism or human rights to describe what you're doing because of the history of what it's felt or sounded like to these communities. So you have to use language that they understand and language that they can relate to make them more amenable to listening and learning about these issues that are happening within their communities.
I think in my experience, I try to use my research as a form or tool of activism. And I think my audience is our community of scholars. I have been very intentional about situating Black narratives as, and I always say it in a lot of my writings, a worthy space for exploration. But I also know that I don't know that a paper is changing anyone's life. And so I like to acknowledge the real systemic issues that at one point Black Americans were experiencing in my work. Now I'm looking at Nigerian transnational communities and Nigerians, and so while I'm excited about it, I also know that this may not translate into a changed life experience for them. And so one way I try to, I guess, navigate the politics around it is to acknowledge it in the work. And by doing so, I am honoring the realities of their experience, as well as communicating to the community of scholars that these are realities that we need to pay attention to. And I'll leave it out there for anyone else who may want to explore and think more critically about some of these systemic issues that they're facing. But I'm not on the field the way Wunpini is, and I really respect that work. I'm more of trying to get our community to not necessarily legitimate or validate, but to create space for us as well and say our voices, our experiences, our stories matter, and these are the systemic situations in which we have found ourselves, and it leaves room for many questions to ask. Well, I'll start with the fact that I know that I'm being optimistic, and I know I cannot generalize. See, this is the part of me that questions the post-positivist training that I received, because at least within an African space, a place with multiple languages, multiple ethnicities, multiple identities, I can't really draw much conclusions. But I do see the possibilities of much more, many more people coming together, seeing the perspective of the other. I'll also start with the history of tension or fracture between different Black people within the diaspora that has been, in my view, cultivated by colonialism. And so for Africans, when they think of Black Americans, they're referencing what they've seen on television, right? At the time, it's so amazing, because even though we have Black Panther, there's still these prevailing images of the Black man as this lazy person. On the other side, Black Americans have this prevailing image of this poor African who is unclothed and lives in huts. And I don't know the last time I saw that. But even as I shared earlier with my 7-year-old daughter and the young boy in her class who's 7 years old, that is the image he has of Africa. And so you have these images, and what I hope for is that when Disney, and I forget the name of that, the series that they recently aired, but it was a Nigerian girl. Does anyone remember the name? But Disney supported this futuristic show featuring a Nigerian girl in Lagos, right? When Disney does that, when we see, again, just more representations of Afrobeats music and African actors, I think it exposes, in the same way that counter stereotypes can impact our positive attitudes towards an outgroup member, I would hope that we can see the same thing too here. And in one of my studies, one thing that came up was a focus group, but one thing that came up is that with social media, at least in the sample, they were able to recognize the truer experiences of Black Americans because they weren't seeing things that were mediated or constructed for them. They were seeing people on TikTok and Instagram. They were understanding the real struggles of African Americans here in the US when it comes to police brutality. So they understood it differently. And interestingly, around that time, at least for the Nigerians in that population, it was during the time of NSARS when they were going through their own battle with the police. And so I think it allowed them to see how we're actually connected. So that's my hope. I hope that the bridging, unfortunately, comes through shared struggle, but also a shared realization of our power and beauty through the nature of storytelling, through our coming together, our collaborations in film and music and television. So that is what I'm hoping for.
That's a very heavy question. Yeah, so what we are seeing now, so before this bill was presented before Parliament and before the LGBT Rights Ghana Center was shut down in February 2021, we did know that there were packets of activism within Ghana around queer and trans rights, but it also seems like when this center was shut down, it sort of thrust them into the limelight, even if they were not ready. And so that meant that there was a lot of mobilizing and activism going on. And before I even proceed, I also just want to say that I'm an activist scholar and I have worked with some of these groups on various platforms to support the liberation of queer and trans people within the country. And so when you look at what is happening right now, it seems like there has been, it's not just a crackdown on queer and trans people in Ghana, it's a crackdown on the freedoms of everyone. So there's been more repression targeted at journalists, to the point where some journalists have had to be taken out of the country for their own safety. There has been a crackdown on the way that people do activism around the environment. So there's just a lot of repression happening in Ghana right now. And I think that it has created the opportunity, especially through the use of social media, for these groups who initially thought that the struggles were separate to begin to see the connections and connect the dots. And so, for example, in the last year there was this protest, Fix the Country. So last year during the Fix the Country demonstration, which was mostly led by queer and trans Ghanaians, the movement had no choice but to incorporate, so in some of their demands, they had no choice but to incorporate the issues affecting queer and trans Ghanaians. And it was because these queer and trans people were not just using social media to mobilize, but they were also on the ground doing work. And also we are seeing that there has been a little bit of a shift from just, doing online campaigns, on Twitter and Facebook and all of those spaces, to actual organizing work on platforms like Signal. So Signal, because of the tracking of WhatsApp and Telegram by governments and all of that, we are seeing more and more people move onto Signal because of the opportunity to be anonymous on Signal, and the ability to be able to use pseudonyms on Signal. And so there's a lot of organizing that is happening on that platform, and that organizing is not just happening within the digital space, but it's also reflecting in the physical physical world. So for example, we just recently, I think yesterday, we were talking about supporting the current movement against galamsey, illegal mining in Ghana, by providing funding from some of the funds that we had generated during the Fix the Country demonstration. So yes, it looks like even though the anti-gay bill has been passed, is opening Ghanaians' eyes to the fact that it's not just queer people who are oppressed, and that promoting the oppression of queer people does not necessarily keep other Ghanaians safe who are not queer. And so it's opening people's eyes to how bad things are and why it's important to move beyond these differences to work toward building a Ghana that is more liberated for everyone. And so I do think that, of course, social media is still important in these organizing efforts, but there's also work that's being done in the physical world. So people are using Signal and WhatsApp and all of these platforms to mobilize, but then they are also going out to protest. So they are using them to plan protests and what to do and organize and have like these, I think we call them working groups. So like there's a working group for media, and there's a working group for mobilizing food, and there's a legal working group. So, we get lawyers into the legal working group to bail people out and all of that. So yeah, we are using these digital spaces, but it's also important to think about the work that is being done in the physical world. And more recently, even though we have organizations like Journalists Against Queer and Trans People in Ghana, we're seeing more and more journalists be radicalized around queer liberation, where they are asking the questions that they didn't previously ask. So in the past, when you got invited to a TV or radio show to talk about the rights of LGBTQI plus Ghanaians, it was the questions that you asked, like that you were asked, was always like, is being gay African? The basic P1, kinds of fundamental questions that they were asking. But we are seeing them move away from that to ask more complex questions around what rights should look like within the African context. So I think even though the bill has been passed, it's not been assented yet by the president, so it cannot be used to jail queer people yet. But there are pockets of hope that we are seeing, especially, for example, within the areas of journalism, also on digital platforms, academia. More and more people are becoming more open to being receptive to the liberation of LGBTQI plus Ghanaians. I think that, outside of our chapter in this volume, there still is an institutionalization of queerness within the Ghanaian space. An institutionalization of queerphobia within the Ghanaian space. It's still a problem. Homophobia is still an everyday thing. Just today, Joy FM published a tweet saying that we should come out and march for the protection of our children, which is code for queer people are coming to rape your children, basically. And so a lot of people reacted and they're like, you can't say that. And so they reposted something and then they tagged it as an advertisement, so that we knew that that's not where they stood. In the past, they deleted the first tweet. That's not much of a change, but at least it's a little bit of a shift from the media organization being like, yeah, we are part of this protest and we are coming out to protest for family values. Really, that's what they called it. The representation of queer people is still horrible within the country, but I also feel like the queer organizations are doing work to navigate interactions with the media in ways that are pushing the media to be more progressive in their line of questions. So for example, when I get invited to do a media interview about the rights of queer people in Ghana, I tell them that I am not going to answer any question about is queerness an African. I tell them a list of things that I'm not going to engage with. And these are the conditions under which I will do this interview. And I tell them, if you ask me any of these questions, I will go off. And it's usually live, like live interviews on TV or radio. And so when you give them those conditions and then you tell them, well, these are the resources that you can consult. There's research out there on these topics. Do the research and then we can talk. some of them begin to see where you're coming from. So for example, I did a radio interview, I believe that was last year when I was in Ghana, where I gave them these conditions. I was like, I'm not going to answer these questions. And it was the most radical interview I had ever had on the issue. I was shocked. So they asked questions like, oh, so if we're talking about queer people, how do we imagine queer rights within the African context, like human rights within the African context, not the Western context? And I'm like, yeah, now that's a good question to think about. Because then they were not only just telling us that, I mean, with that kind of framing, you're saying that, oh, let's look at human rights within the African context and how that is inclusive of queer and trans Ghanaians. And so, I mean, we are pushing them a little bit. And there's another example of a queer activist who was invited on television, and he basically took over the interview. Right? And like they would ask him a question and then he would just take over and be like, you cannot ask this is what you ask. You cannot ask that, this is what you ask. Like you can use these kinds of words. This is the framing that you use to humanize queer and trans people within the country. And of course that means that we have to definitely like develop like a media strategy around this, which means that people have to be media. And another thing that some of these organizations did was that we only allow people who are media trained to do media interviews. If not, you will come off the interview looking defeated and not being able to articulate what you need to articulate. So in some of the organizing work that we do, we actually have media strategy documents, and we're like, okay, here are the talking points, do not veer off. They're going to ask you this, they're going to say that, anticipate that, and do not, take the bait. So there is some hope that there's been a little bit of a shift within the country, even though it does not necessarily mean that LGBTQI plus communities within the country are protected or live dignified lives in Ghana. But yeah, I do believe that we have a long way to go as far as media representation is concerned.
Wow. Well, I'm going to start with a book that I self-published that's not research related. It's Dreams for Our Children, Immigrant Letters to the Future. And in that project, I invited first gen and second gen Americans to write letters to their children to capture their hopes for their kids, to talk about their journeys, because I don't think parents talk enough to their kids about their experiences. But to be honest, the motivation behind that project was because at that time there was this prevailing message about immigrants being a threat to the U.S. And I wanted to create a space where immigrants could be humanized. And I wanted them to be humanized across the different racial categories. So in the book, there are parents who are from Chile, from Cuba, from Nigeria, from Korea, Taiwan, I have one from Poland. And the themes are the same. I was scared. I didn't like where I was, and I wanted something better for me and my kids, no matter what their background was. And that is the hope of any parent anywhere. And I'm hoping that the book itself can serve as a representation. So it's not something that's done through film or television. I did have a podcast where I invited people to talk about their experiences as well. But whether it's through the book or through this podcast production, I hope to put narratives out there that humanize immigrants and counter the message that immigrants are these threats to the American dream. In fact, I argue that they embody it probably more than anyone. And so that's the message that I want to put out there. But what I hope to do with my research is to show just how much, at least in the context of, and I want to be specific about Nigerian culture because that's what I've been studying lately, the way that Nigerian culture and West Africa by extension is influencing pop culture. I'm just again trying to create space to talk about that among scholars. With my documentary, I'm also trying to humanize immigrants and their children and identify the identity struggles that we all have in terms of like, who am I? as a person, and who am I within these social constructs that tell me that I have to be this way. I want to purposely defy these constructs. I want to purposely disrupt them through storytelling, through personal storytelling. And so that's how I've used, not necessarily my research, but really my more creative projects to challenge and counter these narratives. Who are immigrants really is your question? People who are trying to build a life. And I imagine, not just in my imagination, but when I think about the stories I've heard, the stories I've read, these are people who want better for their children. And so they are willing to leave and go where is best for themselves so that they can build a life for the future for their kids. Because who doesn't want to provide for their kids better than what they had? And so that's what I see when I think of immigrants. I think of people who are strong, people who are resilient, people who are humble, people who are caring, who are loyal. And so again, if we could see more of these stories and hear more of them, I think it will counter the fear, the narrative of fear that we hear from political agents who try to make us think that they are coming to steal. But that's the same kind of narrative they try to push about Black people, right? So it's just, it's an old strategy. And that's why I believe in the power of storytelling, in that, again, it challenges the narrative and counters it, and hopefully mitigates some of that fear that some people have bought into. I would say don't be afraid of the question that you have. Don't compromise on the questions that come up for you. Honor the community that you're studying in whatever way that seems fit. Be strategic in how you approach these questions and how you think through the connections between theory and practice. So those are some things that come to mind.
Yes, I agree with everything that you said. To up-and-coming scholar activists or activist scholars, I'll say that pursue what you're passionate about, because sometimes, especially on the research side, if you're not passionate about, sometimes you're working on a project and then you wake up and you don't feel like looking at it. If you're passionate about it, it's the passion that will drive you to proceed with the project. So pursue something that is dear to you. If it's even personal to you, that's even the better. And I'll also say that as an activist scholar, be ungovernable, right? Do not allow yourself to be pushed around, and do not compromise on your values for anything. You will lose opportunities because of your activism, because you're too radical, because you take up too much space, but the opportunities that belong to you will always come to you. So I, as an activist scholar, have I have lost out on opportunities because I'm too radical, I'm too hot. When I say hot, I mean the things that I work on are just too controversial or too political for certain organizations or groups or institutions. And so they're like, oh, we don't want to bring her in to shake up things. But the people who value, the groups, the organizations, the communities that value the work that you do will always find you. And I would say that you would much rather feel at home in spaces that you can be your full self than in spaces that you have to diminish parts of yourself because they're too radical or too political. And in the end, you will feel like you would have been true to yourself if you gravitate more towards spaces that are embracing of you in your wholeness, in your entirety, in your being political and radical.
I'd like to add to that. Find your community. Find a group of people where you can be yourself with and who can cover you and who can be a source of support and encouragement to you while you fight the good fight.
Hi, my name is Srivi Ramasubramanian. I'm the director of CodeShift, a collaboratory for data equity, social healing, inclusive futures, and transformation. Thanks for watching Chai with Srivi.